Israel says they're planning to expand their assault on Gaza this morning. They say they plan to increase their attacks from the air. Israel's defense says they struck down more than 100 targets overnight. They're also reiterating their call for people in northern Gaza to evacuate. This comes as Iran warns Israel, if it does invade Gaza, they'll have no choice to intervene. Dr. Adam Sepp with Texas A&M University joins me to provide a little bit of perspective. Dr. Sepp, thank you for joining us today. A lot of folks don't know exactly what's going on in Israel, so can you provide us some historical context on this Israel-Palestine conflict and how it evolved over time?
Well, Sean, thanks very much for talking to me today. I think anytime you start talking about the Middle East, people want to look back far into the distant past and think about whose land is this and whose land is it not, and I don't think that's very helpful here. I think the crisis that we're seeing unfolding right now has its roots really in the last 100 years, in the plan to create a Jewish state, the state of Israel, in 1948, which resulted in hundreds of thousands of primarily Muslim Palestinians fleeing from their homes and settling in places like Gaza. And then in 1967, during the so-called Six-Day War, Israel took control, occupied a considerable amount of territory, including the Gaza Strip, that Israel needed for its security, or believed it needed for its security, which it then occupied for decades afterward. And what you saw in these areas was the growth of a Palestinian nationalist resistance movement. And one of the groups that emerged out of this in the 1980s was a group called the Islamic Resistance Movement, or Hamas for short. And they are the political movement, the militia that now controls the Gaza Strip, and that has, in the last week, started a really brutal offensive against southern Israel. So I think we can think about this in this kind of long, complex history of the Middle East, but that we really need to keep our eyes focused on what's happened here in the last 100 years in this really quite pivotal region.
So what were some of the key things that happened recently to make this escalation happen?
This is a great question, and I think there are lots, but two that we really need to keep our eyes on. One is that what you've seen in the last few years has been an effort by Israel and Israel's international partners to build better relations between Israel and other parts of the Arab Middle East. And what that's done is that it's isolated groups like Hamas, and it's particularly isolated Hamas's most important backer, which is Iran. And I think one of the things that you've seen in the last week, and one of the reasons that this offensive happened the way that it did and when it did, is that Hamas and its Iranian backers were starting to get worried that this might be their last opportunity. I think the other important factor here is that Israel, which is a democracy, a flawed democracy like every other democracy, it has its weaknesses. Israel has been really preoccupied in the past year, particularly by a series of political crises around the government of Benjamin Netanyahu. And I suspect that Hamas and groups like it looked at this kind of chaotic situation in Israel and thought now might be an excellent opportunity to catch Israel unaware. And that is exactly what happened last Saturday in the brutal attacks that the world witnessed.
And a lot of international leaders have called for an immediate ceasefire. So from a historical perspective, how effective has those ceasefires been in that particular region?
I'm not optimistic about the possibility of a ceasefire. I think if we look at the two sides, Hamas launched those attacks on October 7th in order to provoke an Israeli reaction. This was in a sense what Hamas wanted when they launched those attacks last week. So Hamas does not have a ceasefire in its best interests, and frankly, given the scale of that attack and the brutality of that attack, it would be very difficult for any Israeli government, particularly the one that's in office now, to go to the negotiating tables and talk to Hamas, which would be required in order for there to be an effective ceasefire. So I think while there are international calls for a ceasefire, I don't think either of the sides involved in this has any particular interest in a ceasefire. And frankly, given the number of hostages that Hamas is holding, I think that's yet another stumbling block in any sort of hope for a peaceful resolution, even in the short term.
So at this point, what potential steps or strategies do you see for achieving lasting peace in the region?
Well, I'm looking at the news this morning, and I'm seeing hundreds of thousands of Gazans fleeing to the south. The Israelis are clearly preparing a ground offensive with the goal of breaking Hamas militarily and politically. So in the short term, I'm not optimistic. I think Israel will probably launch this ground offensive. They will almost certainly defeat Hamas militarily. And then the question will come, how do you build a lasting peace? And that is going to require an international effort. There is going to, after this immediate crisis passes, there needs to be an international effort, a series of meetings that bring together actors from across the region to try to find some kind of durable peace. And I hope that out of this awful situation and what I'm afraid is about to get worse, that there will be some desire to find a more durable compromise, but that compromise requires concessions on all sides, and I don't know how much appetite there is right now for those sorts of concessions.
Okay, Dr. Sepp, thank you for your perspective. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Sean.